June 13th, 1943. The Aleutian skies were the kind of brutal cold that cracked metal and stripped courage from the unprepared. On a slate-gray morning, with fog tearing itself apart against the volcanic cliffs of Attu, a lone P-38 Lightning sliced through the clouds, silver, fast, and destined for disaster. The war in this forgotten corner of the Pacific rarely made headlines, but it was here, in these freezing winds, that the aircraft's most deadly secret revealed itself with merciless clarity. The pilot, a young lieutenant barely into his 20s, felt the first sign of trouble long before the instruments registered anything unusual. It was subtle at first, a strange heaviness in the yoke, a soft tremor in the twin booms that didn't match the rhythm of the engines. Moments earlier, he had been enjoying the Lightning's raw speed, its straight-line precision, the way it carved air like a blade sliding across silk. But now something was wrong. The aircraft was beginning to do what P-38 pilots prayed it never would. It was creeping toward compressibility. He pushed forward to stabilize the nose. Nothing. He pulled back harder, sweat already chilling on his face. Still nothing. The horizon began to tilt, and the cockpit, usually a cocoon of control and order, became a shrinking cage of glass and gauges. The altimeter spun downward as if possessed. The yoke stiffened into stone. Oxygen hissed uselessly around him while gravity crushed his chest against the harness. He had entered the Lightning's death zone. Below him, the ground crews heard the scream before they saw the aircraft. A thin, unnatural howl of metal cutting through forbidden speed. Men dropped tools, shouted warnings, scanned the sky with hands shielding their eyes. They knew that sound. They had heard it before. They had watched pilots die to it. There was a moment when every mechanic on the line went silent, waiting for the inevitable flash of silver turning into an explosion of earth and fire. But the pilot refused to surrender. Through a tightening tunnel of vision, he slammed his left rudder, then the right, then both, trying to break the dive with brute force. The world spun faster. Gravity felt like it was trying to tear him apart. For a fraction of a second, he saw his own hands shaking against the control column and thought about the letter in his breast pocket. Unfinished, folded twice, addressed to a woman who would never understand why the sky demanded so many men in their 20s. And then, in a miracle that looked more like violence than grace, the P-38 finally responded. A shudder, a crack, a groaning protest from deep within its structure, and the nose lifted. Barely. The Lightning clawed its way out of the dive just seconds before impact, leveling so low that the tips of its propellers kicked curtains of snow from the tundra. It limped back toward base, its pilot half-conscious, its fuselage trembling like a creature that had come back from the dead. When the wheels hit the frozen runway, the ground crew ran to meet it, not celebrating survival, but staring with the haunted recognition of men who knew this wasn't a victory. It was an accident postponed, a flaw uncorrected, a curse still living inside the wings of the most advanced fighter America had ever built. This was the dual identity of the P-38 Lightning in 1943. A machine of breathtaking innovation whose sharp edges hid a deadly secret. To commanders, it was a technological marvel, the spear tip of American air power, a design so futuristic it seemed born ahead of its time. But to the pilots who strapped themselves into its narrow cockpit, it was something else entirely, a weapon that could turn on its master without warning, dragging even the most skilled aviator into a dive too steep, too fast, too final to escape. Rumors traveled faster than official memos. Pilots whispered about the tuck, the sudden downward pitch that felt like invisible hands twisting the aircraft into a grave. They spoke of the controls freezing completely, as if the Lightning were locking the crew out of its own fate. The mechanics hated the whispers, but they hated even more the funerals those whispers predicted with eerie accuracy. The engineers back in California had theories, charts, equations, wind tunnel data. They spoke of shock waves forming across the wings, of airflow separating from surfaces, of thresholds no aircraft had ever crossed before. But theory was cold comfort to the men watching their squadron mates vanish into fatal dives. In these remote wind-scoured bases, there was no room for theory. Only wreckage, bent propellers, shattered cockpits, twisted aluminum dragged from crash sites by hand. The men who worked among these ruins saw something the engineers couldn't: patterns, not in data, but in scars. They noticed which parts bent, which parts tore, which parts survived when everything else didn't. They heard things in the engines that didn't match the manuals. They felt vibration changes through wrenches and rivets, through cold fingers hardened by midnight repairs under oily lamps. This was the world of the front-line mechanic: grit, instinct, and a sixth sense for trouble. And among them, there was one man. One mechanic who did not hold an engineering degree, did not wear officer's stripes, and did not trust the comfortable explanations printed in technical bulletins. He had seen too many lightnings crash in ways that didn't match the diagrams. He had listened carefully to pilots who survived close calls, catching details others ignored. He began to believe the fatal dives were not just aerodynamics, but something deeper, something mechanical, something the engineers had missed. He couldn't prove it. Not yet, but he couldn't ignore it either. While the P-38 community searched for answers in boardrooms and laboratories, he was about to stumble onto a truth hidden in plain sight. A truth that would challenge official doctrine, defy engineering orthodoxy, and ultimately save countless pilots from a flaw that had nearly doomed the Lightning's legacy. But before his strange idea could take shape, the war would force him to see the P-38's flaw one more time. Up close, undeniable, and impossible to ignore. What the pilot in the Aleutians had faced that morning wasn't superstition, bad luck, or a momentary lapse in skill. It was the unavoidable collision between cutting-edge engineering and the unforgiving laws of physics. Laws that neither Lockheed nor the U.S. Army Air Forces fully understood when the P-38 Lightning first took flight. The flaw lived not in one single component, but in the invisible world of air itself, where pressure, speed, and shock conspired in ways no American aircraft had ever encountered before. The Lightning was a masterpiece born too early. Its twin-boom design, radical for its time, stretched across the sky like a pair of silver spears. Its turbo superchargers unlocked speeds that placed it in a domain usually reserved for theory, not combat. It could climb faster, dive harder, and hit higher altitudes than anything America had flown before. But in pushing performance past known boundaries, the engineers had unintentionally built an aircraft that could outrun its own aerodynamics. Pilots described the onset of compressibility not as a clear moment, but as a tightening trap. It began subtly, a stiffness in the yoke, a vibration that resonated in the bones rather than the instruments. Then the aircraft would start to tuck, the nose angling downward as if pulled by some unseen force. Once the dive began, every instinct a pilot had learned became useless. Pulling back on the yoke only made the dive worse. Fighting the aircraft felt like fighting a storm that had already claimed victory. In the early months of deployment, air commands refused to believe what pilots were reporting. America's premier fighter, flawed. Impossible. Reports were softened, rewritten, or dismissed as the mistakes of inexperienced aviators. Test pilots landed dazed and pale, swearing something was happening in the flight envelope. Commanders, pressured by the urgency of war, chalked it up to nerves. Technical officers blamed altitude effects, fatigue, or improper trim. But the crashes continued, and the wreckage told the truth with a brutal kind of honesty. Mechanics began to notice a disturbing pattern. Once a P-38 entered a certain speed zone, it behaved like a machine possessed. Control surfaces locked rigid, dive angles increased sharply, and when the aircraft hit thicker air at lower altitude, the sudden forces ripped metal, snapped spars, and sometimes tore wings clean off. The men recovering these broken machines weren't dealing with mysteries. They were handling evidence. And every bent panel and buckled spar whispered the same message. Something deep within the Lightning's design was working against its own pilots. One pilot described the experience in a report he was careful not to make public. "It felt like the sky turned solid around me, like the air wanted me dead." This wasn't melodrama. It was physics. At high speeds, air no longer flowed smoothly over the P-38's wings. Instead, shock waves formed, thin, invisible walls of compressed air that changed the behavior of the aircraft completely. The center of lift shifted. The nose dipped. The tail lost authority. The entire aircraft became a weapon aimed at the earth, impossible to command until it slowed on its own, if it slowed at all. But the men living with the lightning day after day noticed something. The engineers didn't. The phenomenon didn't strike every aircraft the same way. Some lightnings were more prone to the deadly dive. Some recovered slightly easier, and some, eerily, behaved differently depending on squadron, location, or even specific maintenance crews. To the pilots, this made the Flaw feel like Russian roulette. One moment, the aircraft was a graceful predator capable of outrunning the enemy. The next, it was a trap, one that could snap shut without warning. The psychological burden was immense. Young men climbed into cockpits knowing that victory or death depended not merely on their enemy's aim, but on the whims of airflow and a flaw buried in the metal beneath them. This was the heart of the P-38's dual nature. To Washington, it remained a technological triumph. To the Germans, it was a feared high-altitude phantom capable of long-range ambush. But to the crews in Alaska, the Pacific, and Europe, it was both friend and executioner. Mechanics worked late into the night, staring at warped aluminum and shattered stabilizers, looking for anything, any clue, that might explain why some aircraft tore themselves apart while others survived identical dives. Engineers offered graphs, pilots offered fear, mechanics offered questions. And buried in these frontline struggles was a tension no official report dared state plainly. The experts didn't have the answer. Not yet. Lockheed's brightest minds pored over wind tunnel data, wrestling with equations that hinted at the truth but stopped short of fully explaining it. Commanders demanded solutions under deadlines written in blood. And flight crews watched young men take off with confidence and return as smoke rising from the tundra. That was the war's cruel rhythm. Innovation at headquarters, funerals at the front. But under all the chaos, a quiet pattern was forming. Mechanics on remote bases began seeing similarities in the failures, things too small, too trivial for the official analyses, but too consistent to ignore. Lines of stress along the same rivets, strange wear marks inside control assemblies, slight deviations in the balance of parts that should have been identical. It was here, among the cold tools and the grease-stained hands, that intuition began to outrun theory. Some men believed the Flaw was aerodynamic, others swore it was mechanical. Most assumed the answer was beyond their pay grade, but one mechanic, working far from the polished floors of Lockheed, was about to look at a piece of wreckage and see something no engineer had ever documented. He had no formal training in aerodynamics, no calculus, no wind tunnel experience. What he had was instinct, sharpened by hundreds of hours repairing an aircraft that behaved differently every time the mercury dropped, the engines aged, or the pilots pushed it past its limits. And in that instinct, he would find the key. While test pilots experimented with new dive techniques and engineers debated theory, this frontline mechanic would notice a tiny, overlooked detail, something so unremarkable that it had never been included in a single report. Yet it held the potential to explain why the lightning sometimes crossed the edge of control, and why sometimes it didn't. The war was closing in, pilots were dying, and the clock had run out for theories that required years of study. What the P-38 needed now wasn't abstract science. It was a practical, immediate, battlefield-born fix. Something real, something mechanical, something that could be implemented with tools, sweat, and courage. And soon, that mechanic's odd observation would collide with a moment of desperation, forcing the squadron to reconsider everything they believed about the lightning and the deadly Flaw hiding in its wings. He was not the kind of man history books remember. Not a pilot, not a commander, not an engineer with blueprints spread across a mahogany desk. He was a mechanic, the kind of anonymous soldier whose name rarely survived the war, whose hands carried more scars than medals, and whose contributions were measured not in speeches or reports, but in the quiet hum of an aircraft returning safely from combat. He worked on the frozen edges of the Aleutian Theater, where the wind was a living enemy and machines aged twice as fast. And while officers debated theory in warm rooms, he stood ankle-deep in mud and frost, staring at the broken remains of a fighter that wasn't supposed to fail. He had learned the P-38 piece by piece, its wiring, its quirks, the way a certain bolt felt when torqued correctly, the faint vibration a good engine made compared to a tired one. Mechanics in the field didn't read aerodynamics textbooks. They read metal. They read smell, sound, tension. They knew when an aircraft was lying, when a pilot's account didn't match what the bones of the airframe revealed. And this man, more than most, had a gift for it. He had been there when the Lightning from Section 1 limped home, its skin still trembling, its pilot semi-conscious. He helped pull the shaken young lieutenant from the cockpit, listening carefully as the man tried to describe the dive, his voice cracking, his hands still gripping that invisible yoke. The mechanic didn't pity him. He studied him. The details mattered. Every word mattered. But it wasn't the confession of terror that caught his attention. It was something small, something technical, something the pilot said almost accidentally. It felt like the controls froze unevenly, like one side locked first. Unevenly, one side first. That was not an aerodynamic phenomenon. That was something mechanical, something asymmetrical, something that shouldn't be possible if the aircraft were behaving purely according to airflow and physics. That single phrase lodged itself in the mechanic's mind like a shard of metal. Later, when the Lightning was hauled into the maintenance bay, he crawled under the wings with a flashlight, ignoring the cold ground biting through his uniform. The other crewmen chalked off the damage as another compressibility dive. He didn't. He went straight for the aileron linkages, then the elevator controls, then the trim tabs. He disassembled components others assumed were irrelevant, laying out parts in neat, obsessive rows. His fingers traced each surface, feeling for microscopic inconsistencies. And then he saw it. It wasn't dramatic. Just a slight deformation, a tiny warping of a linkage component buried deep inside the tail assembly. Most men would have missed it under perfect lighting. In the dim, oil-streaked gloom of a front-line workshop, it was nearly invisible. Yet to him, it was a revelation. That tiny bend, multiplied by the stresses of high-speed flight, could create a fractional delay in control response. A fractional delay at 400 miles per hour could become lethal. It explained the pilot's comment. It explained why not every P-38 behaved the same way in a dive. And it whispered something far more dangerous. The flaw might not be entirely aerodynamic. Part of it, just part, could be mechanical, a defect that grew over time. A balance issue that engineers had never tested for because they assumed perfect manufacturing conditions, perfect maintenance, perfect symmetry. Conditions that did not exist in the mud, cold, and chaos of a war zone. He didn't celebrate the discovery. He felt it like a weight settling onto his shoulders. Because noticing a flaw was one thing. Suggesting an unapproved fix, especially one that contradicted official doctrine, was another. Mechanics did not challenge engineering divisions. They followed manuals. They did not rewrite them, but he couldn't shake the sight of that warped component. He saw it every time he closed his eyes, every time another Lightning took off, every time he heard the howl of a high-speed dive echo across the mountains. He started checking other aircraft quietly, without making a fuss, without alerting the officers. At first, nothing. Then a slight irregularity on another machine, a similar pattern on a third. It wasn't universal, but it was consistent enough to confirm his suspicion. This minor mechanical distortion was forming gradually across multiple P-38s. He rebuilt the components on his own time, reshaping them, adjusting their balance, experimenting with tension and alignment. But the more he worked, the clearer it became that the solution he envisioned, his strange idea, wasn't a simple repair. It was a modification, a deliberate, structural change, one that required authority he didn't have. When he finally approached the squadron engineering officer, the conversation went exactly as he had feared. The officer listened politely, masking irritation behind the tight professionalism of a man overloaded with responsibilities. A mechanic proposing a fix to a national-level engineering problem? The very suggestion bordered on insubordination. When the mechanic described the warped components and asymmetrical control response, the officer responded with the same phrase mechanics had heard for months. Compressibility is aerodynamic, not mechanical. Follow the manual. The mechanic left the tent with his jaw locked and his fists clenched. He wasn't angry at the officer. He was angry at the certainty, the absolute faith in diagrams drawn thousands of miles away. The war didn't operate on perfect symmetry. Aircraft aged, metal flexed, forces changed. The manuals didn't account for battlefield reality, but the men flying those aircraft were dying in that reality. So he did what field mechanics always did when the chain of command refused to adapt. He experimented quietly, and in those experiments, he came up with a strange fix, an unorthodox adjustment, a way of altering the control response using tools, not theory. It wasn't dangerous, but it wasn't authorized. And above all, it contradicted everything the official engineering manuals stated about the Lightning. He tested it on a grounded aircraft first. The behavior felt promising. The controls moved with an evenness he hadn't felt before. Something subtle but undeniably different, like tension that had gone unnoticed had finally been released. But theory wasn't proof. And the war did not reward half answers. A pilot would have to test it. In the air, in a dive, at the speed where the Lightning became a coin flip between survival and oblivion. And as the mechanic stepped back from his modified aircraft, wiping grease from his fingers and staring at the machine in the dim light of the hangar, he knew this was the moment everything would change. Either his strange fix would save men's lives, or it would condemn him as the fool who dared to challenge the aircraft's sacred design. The war would decide which. Dawn in the Aleutians was a slow, reluctant thing. Light seeping through a sky that always seemed bruised, as if the weather itself carried the memory of every aircraft that had been lost to it. The mechanic stood outside the hangar long before anyone else arrived, staring at the P-38 he had altered. It sat on the frost-bitten ground like a sleeping predator, its twin booms catching the cold light, its propellers motionless and perfectly still. Most men saw a fighter. He saw a question, a gamble, a challenge thrown directly at the laws of the sky. Word of his unauthorized modification had spread quietly across the squadron. Some pilots reacted with curiosity, others with suspicion, a few with outright disdain, but all of them, every last one, understood what was really being asked. Someone needed to fly an aircraft altered outside official engineering doctrine, and then intentionally push it into a compressibility dive, an act that had already killed more than one man. This wasn't just testing a theory. It was tempting fate. The volunteer came from an unexpected place, not a reckless hotshot, not a fresh-faced recruit desperate to prove himself. Instead, it was a veteran. Captain Whitaker, a pilot who had flown everything from freezing recon missions to low-level strafing runs that came back with branches embedded in the wing. He wasn't fearless. He was simply steady. The kind of man who understood the stakes and didn't need applause. When he approached the mechanic that morning, he didn't offer a speech or a handshake. He just asked one question. "If I take it up, would you bet your life on what you did?" The mechanic didn't flinch. "I already have," he replied. Whitaker nodded. That was enough. The ground crew gathered as the captain climbed into the cockpit. The canopy lowered with a crisp metallic snap that seemed louder than usual. The pilot adjusted his harness. Instruments flickered to life. The engines ignited with a deep, throaty rumble that rolled across the runway like thunder building inside a mountain. Men stepped back as the twin Allison engines warmed, each pulse of the exhaust a reminder that once the wheels left the ground, the outcome would be decided entirely by physics, instinct, and whatever strange idea the mechanic had stitched into the aircraft's bones. When the P-38 taxied forward, the mechanic felt a tightness in his chest he had never known. He had prepared this aircraft countless times for missions, but never like this. Never with his own idea hidden inside it. Never with a man's life directly tied to a decision he alone had made. The war demanded courage from pilots. But on that morning, the mechanic realized it demanded courage from the men, with wrenches as well. The Lightning rolled onto the runway. Engines roared, frost scattered in the slipstream, and then, with a surge that vibrated through the earth, it leapt into the sky. Climbing through the low clouds, Whitaker kept the aircraft steady, testing the basic controls. Nothing unusual. The mechanic's adjustments were invisible at this altitude. No wobble, no drag, no unexpected trim changes. For a moment, the radio crackled with idle conversation from other aircraft in the area, but Whitaker remained silent. This wasn't a routine flight. This was a confrontation between an aircraft and the Flaw that had stalked it since its first day in combat. Once he reached altitude, he leveled off. The wind hissed against the canopy. The engines settled into their rhythmic hum. Below him, the world stretched out in a vast landscape of ice, mountains, and cloud shadows, deadly terrain for a pilot who lost control. He took a breath, tightened his grip on the yoke, and banked slightly to position himself for the dive. Down on the ground, the crew watched the tiny silver shape high above them. The mechanic stood completely still, his jaw locked, his hands clenched behind his back. He had seen aircraft go into compressibility before. He knew the signs. He knew the sound. The long, distant howl that marked the beginning of a death spiral. Every nerve inside him was braced for it. Whitaker positioned the Lightning at altitude, angled the nose downward, and let gravity take hold. At first, everything felt normal. The dive steepened. Airspeed climbed. The engines roared in symmetrical harmony. The altimeter spun with growing urgency. But then came the moment every P-38 pilot feared, the threshold. The speed where airflow thickened into a cage. The point where controls stiffened and the aircraft began to decide its own destiny. The Lightning shuddered. The nose dipped harder. The dive deepened. Whitaker pushed forward gently, testing, probing, feeling for resistance. And then something happened that no pilot had ever felt before in a Lightning under compressibility conditions. The controls didn't freeze unevenly. They remained even. Sluggish, yes. Heavy, absolutely. But symmetrical, balanced, predictable. It was like wrestling a giant, but a giant whose movements he could anticipate. Still diving, he applied a touch more back pressure. A second shudder. Then, impossibly, incrementally, the nose began to lift. On the ground, the mechanic heard the distant change in engine pitch, a sign he recognized instantly. The aircraft was recovering. Not fighting, not resisting, recovering. The Lightning stabilized, leveled, climbed. Whitaker exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. His hands trembled slightly on the controls, not from fear, but from astonishment. The fix worked. The aircraft had survived a dive that should have locked it into a death spiral. It hadn't escaped compressibility. No fix could rewrite the laws of aerodynamics, but it had endured it, and regained control sooner than any untouched P-38 ever could. He radioed the base. His voice was steady, but there was something underneath it, something electric. "Tell the boys, it works." Down below, the maintenance crew erupted in shouts, laughter, raw disbelief. But the mechanic didn't celebrate. Not yet. He stared at the sky, his heart pounding. The test had worked once, but the war didn't measure success in single victories. It demanded reliability, repeatability, proof. Whitaker circled back. And then, astonishingly, voluntarily, he did it again. Another dive. Another push through the speed barrier, another pullout that held true. This time, when the Lightning leveled out, The mechanic allowed himself to breathe. When Whitaker landed, the ground crew swarmed the aircraft like soldiers greeting a returning hero. The pilot stepped down from the ladder, removed his gloves, and extended his hand. The mechanic shook it silently, the weight of the moment settling into the cold air between them. The fix, his fix, had survived the sky, but the true test still waited. Would the brass approve it? Would other squadrons adopt it? Would it spread fast enough to save lives before the war claimed more? The next step would not be technical. It would be political, procedural, and fought with pen, report, and argument. And that battle was about to begin. In the days that followed Captain Whitaker's test flights, the base seemed to hum with a new kind of energy, part disbelief, part pride, part fear that the truth might be buried before it could save anyone else. The mechanic's strange fix had worked, not once, but repeatedly, proving itself in the only arena that mattered, the merciless sky. But the war was not a place that welcomed new ideas easily, especially when they came from the bottom of the hierarchy. The fix needed to travel upward, past officers, past skepticism, past the rigid spine of military protocol. And bureaucracy, even in war, could be slower than a dive pulling 600 miles per hour. Whitaker filed his report with a clarity that left no room for misinterpretation. His words were deliberate, soldier-like, stripped of embellishment. He described the dive, the onset of compressibility, the feel of the controls, and above all, the even response, the symmetry that had never existed before the mechanic's modification. When he finished, he handed it to the squadron engineering officer with a look that said, "Everything unsaid. This is real, and if you ignore it, men will die." Officers who had once dismissed the mechanic's concerns now found themselves staring at evidence they could not deny. They inspected the altered components, cross-checked the changes, and compared them with the untouched aircraft. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't elegant. It didn't solve the scientific mystery of compressibility, but it made the Lightning survivable. And in the cold mathematics of war, survivability mattered more than theory. Still, change did not happen instantly. Higher commands questioned the mechanic's authority to make structural adjustments. They questioned the repeatability of the results. They questioned whether a field-borne modification could be standardized, or whether it might introduce risks unseen. But every day they hesitated. More P-38s entered combat. More pilots flew into dives that tested the limits of luck and physics. And then something unexpected happened, something that no regulation could contain. Word spread. Informally, rapidly, the way truth always moves among soldiers who cannot afford to lie to each other. Pilots wrote to other squadrons. Mechanics copied each other's work in dimly lit hangars. Crews traveling through nearby bases carried the story with them like a military folktale. There's a fix for the dive. It's simple, it works. Ask for the Lightning with the balanced controls. By the time official approval was grinding its way through channels, the modification was already spreading on its own, passed hand to hand like contraband salvation. The war had a way of bypassing red tape when enough men wanted to stay alive. Soon, the effect began to show in combat reports. P-38s in the Pacific started returning from missions with fewer, unexplained losses. Squadrons in the Mediterranean noticed their pilots were pulling out of dives that would have been fatal just months earlier. Recon units flying over Europe, where the Lightning often had to push speed limits to avoid enemy interceptors, reported improved control under high-speed duress. Pilots didn't know the mechanic's name. They didn't know the details of his fix. They only knew one truth. The Lightning no longer felt like a coin toss. The transformation was subtle at first, but with each mission, the aircraft's identity began to shift. The P-38 had always been fast, long-range, and lethal in the hands of a skilled pilot. But now it carried something new. Confidence, not arrogance, confidence. A trust that when pushed beyond the edge, it would fight to come back instead of folding into inevitability. In dogfights, this mattered. German and Japanese pilots learned the hard way that the Lightning could now pursue in a dive, something it had never been trusted to do before. Luftwaffe fighters who tried to escape by dropping suddenly found the P-38 was no longer haunted by its flaw. It chased with discipline. It dove with purpose. And it recovered in time to climb again. The mechanic's fix didn't turn the Lightning into a perfect machine. Nothing could tame compressibility entirely, but it allowed pilots to use the aircraft's natural strengths without constantly fighting its hidden demon. And in a war where the margin between death and survival was measured in seconds, those seconds were everything. But the story didn't end on the battlefield. When Lockheed engineers eventually reviewed the field reports, they were stunned by the mechanic's intuitive leap. What he had done in a frozen, trench-lined hangar had addressed a nuance of control symmetry that the official design had never accommodated. His solution wasn't theoretical. It was tactile, grounded in the fingerprints of the aircraft itself. It worked because it responded to how the Lightning aged in real combat conditions, not in controlled factory settings. Engineering teams refined his idea, standardized it, and eventually incorporated variations of it into later models and official maintenance procedures. The fix, once unofficial and almost forbidden, became part of the evolution of one of America's most iconic fighters. It wouldn't make the newspapers, it wouldn't appear in a documentary reel at the time, but it became part of the aircraft's bloodstream, part of the reason so many pilots lived to tell their stories. Years later, long after the war ended, veterans credited the P-38 for its speed, its firepower, its reach. But those who truly knew the aircraft spoke of something deeper. They recalled the early days when the Lightning was brilliant but unpredictable. When flying, it required both courage and a touch of fatalism. And they remembered how everything changed, not because of a new wing design, not because of a breakthrough in a California laboratory, but because of a mechanic, an ordinary man, who noticed something the experts had missed. He wasn't seeking praise. He wasn't looking for glory. He simply refused to accept that men should die because a machine wasn't understood well enough. His strange fix didn't make him famous, but it made the P-38 worthy of its legend. The final irony was almost poetic. The aircraft once feared for its deadliest flaw became, in the end, one of the most trusted diving fighters of the Allied arsenal. A transformation born not from bureaucracy, but from grit, from intuition, from a man whose name may be forgotten but whose fingerprints changed the Lightning's destiny. The documentary closes with an image that lingers, the silhouette of a P-38 soaring across a cloud-streaked sky, its twin booms glinting in the sun. Beneath that quiet canvas lies the legacy of the mechanic's idea, a reminder that sometimes the course of history is altered not by generals or factories, but by the smallest hands on the flight line, working in silence while the world sleeps.